You can't treat me like this, my prince. You took away my innocence. You told me you loved me, and now I am in love with you, that I can't even hold back myself anymore. That night was a mistake, he said, his voice rising slightly. I am sorry it happened, and I will do whatever it takes to make it right. But there is nothing between us. I feel nothing for you. The people of Omenka gathered outside the grand gates of the palace, eyes wide with excitement and hearts pounding as they waited for the return of their beloved prince. It had been a long, long time, over 16 years, since Prince Dozier had left the village. Dozier was not just any young man. He was the only son, the only child of King Amadike. The king, in his great wisdom, had sent his precious son across the vast oceans to the land of the white man. He wanted Dozier to get the finest education, to learn about new inventions and technology, and to grow into a wiser, kinder, and more skilled leader for the people. But when Prince Dozier finished his education, he did something that left his parents heartbroken and worried. He chose to stay back in the foreign land, deciding to start his life there instead of returning to his homeland. This choice weighed heavily on the king and queen. They worried day and night because Dozier was the heir to the throne. Without him, the throne would be taken away from King Amadike, and all his hard work would be in vain. He needed to return home, be with his people, learn from his father's wisdom, to feel the deep connection to his ancestors and the traditions of their kingdom, and to get married to his betrothed, who has been waiting for him. Months turned into years, and every passing day seemed to stretch their worry. They wrote letter after letter, urging him to come back, expressing their fears and hopes, pleading with him to remember his people and his duty as the future king. But no matter how heartfelt their words were, Dozier did not return. It was as if he had chosen a life that left the kingdom behind. The people whispered in worry, wondering if the prince had forgotten them. The king felt a deep sadness, thinking of all his hard work to keep the family's legacy strong and proud. How could it be that his only child, his beloved son, would throw it all away? Worst part was that his betrothed Princess Kedi and her family were becoming worried. Then, one fateful day, a letter arrived. A letter from Prince Dozier himself. He was finally coming home. The news was like a ray of sunshine, bursting through the stormy clouds that had hung over the palace for so long. The king and queen could hardly believe it. Their faces lit up with joy, their smiles growing wider and brighter as they realized their long wait was over. All their fears melted away, replaced by pure happiness. The king quickly called together the elders and the palace workers, announcing the joyful news to all. He planned a grand feast to celebrate the homecoming of the prince, filling the air with music and laughter as preparations began. Word of the prince's return spread like wildfire throughout the village, and soon everyone in Omenka was buzzing with excitement. People talked about what they would wear, how they would greet the prince, and what gifts they would bring to welcome him. They could hardly contain their joy, counting down the days until they would finally see their prince again. It was truly a beautiful moment, for the great kingdom of Omenka, a day that would be remembered for years to come. The day everyone had been waiting for finally came. The villagers of Omenka gathered outside the palace gates, dressed in their finest clothes, shimmering and colorful. Every corner of the palace grounds was alive with excitement. Drums echoed across the land as people sang and danced, filling the air with music and joy. Smiles and laughter lit up every face, and everyone's hearts beat fast, eager for the prince's return. In the palace, the king and queen sat on their thrones, watching the celebration from afar, feeling the same excitement and happiness. They had been waiting for this moment for so many years. Today, they would finally see their son, Prince Dozier, again. The royal guards had gone to pick him up from the airport, and they knew he would arrive any minute. Then, suddenly, a loud cheer burst through the crowd. The drumming grew louder, and the songs became even more joyful. People started jumping up and down, hugging one another with excitement. "The prince is here! The prince is here!" they shouted with all their might. The villagers raised their hands and called out his name as Prince Dozier, dressed in his elegant attire, walked through the crowd. He looked strong, confident and full of kindness as he waved to the people. As he approached the palace, the queen couldn't hold back any longer. She jumped up from her throne, ran down the palace steps and wrapped her arms around her son in a warm, tight embrace. It had been 17 long years since she last held him close, and her heart was bursting with happiness she couldn't put into words. The king watched this beautiful reunion between mother and son, his own eyes shining with tears. Prince Dozier had grown so much. He was now a tall, handsome young man with the strength and dignity of a leader. The king felt so proud, so filled with joy to see his son after so many years. Finally, Dozier approached his father and, with deep respect, he bowed before him. "You've grown so much, my son," the king said with a wide smile. "Welcome back home." Dozier felt happiness welling up in his heart as he looked around. He saw all the excited faces of the villagers, the people who had waited so long to welcome him home. He stepped forward, joining them in their joyful celebration. He danced and laughed with the villagers, his smile as bright as the stars in the night sky. The drums played on, filling the evening with rhythm and life, and the people of Omenka celebrated late into the night, thrilled that their prince was finally home where he belonged. The next morning, the village streets were buzzing with chatter about the prince, especially among the young maidens. As they walked along the dusty paths on their way to the stream, their excitement filled the air. They talked in hushed voices, but their smiles and sparkling eyes made it clear that the prince had left a big impression on them. Every maiden seemed to have her own thoughts about Prince Dozier, and they couldn't help but share every detail with one another. "Oh, I just couldn't look away from him during the whole celebration yesterday," one maiden said, sighing dreamily. "Our prince is so handsome. Truly the most stunning man I've ever seen in my life." Another maiden quickly jumped in, her voice filled with excitement. "Yes, I totally agree with you. I couldn't stop thinking about his beautiful face, that I ended up dreaming about him all through the night. He looked like a god. His eyes, his nose, his strong build, oh, everything about him is just perfect." The girls giggled As they imagined what it would be like to catch the prince's eyes. "I only hope he's ready to pick a wife," another maiden added with a mischievous grin. "If he is, I'll be the first in line to try my luck." They all laughed, but then one of them spoke up thoughtfully. "Honestly, who wouldn't want to be the wife of the prince? He's handsome, and also the heir to the throne of Omenka. It's every girl's dream. But I don't think the prince would choose a commoner like us. I hear that he has been betrothed to a beautiful princess, and all we can do is to only wish." The group fell silent for a moment, each girl lost in her own thoughts. Deep down, they all knew she might be right. The prince was royalty after all, and they were just ordinary village maidens. But that didn't stop their hearts from wishing. Each of them secretly dreamed that somehow the prince might notice her, see her kindness, or admire her beauty, and maybe, just maybe, choose her as his bride. After a few moments, the silence broke as they started laughing and talking again. They couldn't help but let their imaginations run wild, creating stories of what life might be like as the prince's wife. With all these happy thoughts filling their minds, they continued down the path towards the stream, each step carrying them deeper into their dreams of love and royalty. As night fell and the sky above Omenka glowed with a sea of twinkling stars, Prince Dozier stood by his window, feeling a mix of excitement and nostalgia. He held a glass of wine in his hand, slowly sipping as he gazed out at the breathtaking landscape before him. The rolling hills and the majestic mountains of Omenka stretched as far as he could see, bathed in the soft moonlight. This view had been one of his favorites as a child, and he realized just how much he had missed it during his years away. Standing there now, memories came flooding back, running through the fields as a boy, climbing the trees and watching the sun set over the mountains. He was so wrapped up in his thoughts that he almost didn't hear the soft knock at his door. "Come in," he called, his gaze still on the horizon. The door opened, and as he turned, he felt his heart skip a beat. Walking through the doorway was the most beautiful maiden he had ever seen. She wore the simple dress of a palace maid, but there was something captivating about her. Prince Dozier blinked, almost wondering if he was imagining things. Was this real? His mouth fell open slightly as he took in her graceful presence, her gentle expression, and her shy smile. She began to speak, but he could barely focus on her words. He was completely mesmerized by her beauty. Her eyes sparkled softly in the candlelight, her cheeks flushed, and her voice sounded as soft as a melody. The only words he managed to catch were, "Dinner is ready." Before he could gather his thoughts to respond, she finished speaking and hurried out, closing the door behind her with a shy smile. As soon as she was gone, Prince Dozier let out a low whistle. "She's so beautiful," he whispered to himself, a smile spreading across his face. He couldn't shake the image of her from his mind, her soft, fluttering gaze, her graceful movements, and that gentle voice that seemed to wrap around him like a warm breeze. But suddenly, he snapped out of his thoughts. "What am I thinking?" he muttered, feeling slightly embarrassed. This isn't the time to be thinking about a woman of all things. He had just gotten out of a bad relationship and had returned home to heal. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind. His parents were waiting for him at the dining table and he needed to go downstairs for dinner. With one last glance out the window, he set down his glass and took a deep breath, determined to focus on his family and the evening ahead. But as he walked towards the door, he couldn't help but smile, feeling a flicker of excitement he hadn't expected. As the family sat around the grand dining table, the warm, comforting smells of the evening meal filled the air. Prince Dozier took a bite of his favorite local delicacy, savoring the taste he had missed for so many years. His mother's eyes sparkled as she looked at him, unable to contain her joy. "Oh, my son, you have no idea how much I've missed you. Having you back home feels like a dream come true," she said with a soft smile. "There were times I thought we had lost you forever." Dozier returned her smile, feeling a deep warmth in his heart. He was happy to be home with his family and to be surrounded by the sights, smells and flavors of his childhood. But as he glanced at his father, King Amadike, he noticed something serious in his gaze. The king had been silent all evening, and now he cleared his throat, signaling he had something important to say. Dozier felt his heartbeat quicken. He knew this moment would come, though he hadn't expected it so soon. He sensed the urgency in his father's last letter, urging him to return, and he realized he could no longer avoid his responsibilities. He was the only son, and his parents had no one else to depend on for the future of their kingdom. The king's deep voice filled the room. "Dozier, my son," he began, his tone filled with both love and concern. "You're welcome back home. Every day, I have prayed to see you with my own eyes again before I pass on. Today, I am truly grateful to the gods." "Thank you, Father," Dozier replied, trying to steady himself for what he knew was coming next. The king continued, his words calm but firm. "You have grown into a full man now, and we do not have much time. I am old, and my strength fades with each passing day. You must prepare to take on your duties as the future king. I know you have learned much, and I trust you will lead our people well, even better than I have." Dozier was silent, his mind racing. And then, his father's next words fell like a heavy weight. "We want you to get married as soon as possible." Dozier's eyes widened in surprise. "What? Father, I just returned. I need time to settle in, to even find someone I love." He was shocked. Of all the things he had expected tonight, talk of marriage had not been one of them. He had thought his father might be angry with him for staying away so long and ignoring their numerous letters. But this, it was too sudden. He had only returned yesterday, and barely after 24 hours, they were already talking about marriage. His mother leaned forward, her voice gentle but serious. "Son, listen to your father. He grows weaker with each passing day, and his brothers have their eyes on the throne. If anything were to happen to him before you are married, we could lose everything. This is why we need you to marry quickly. The gods brought you back home at the perfect time." Dozier looked at his mother, his voice filled with desperation. "But mother, shouldn't I have the chance to find someone I care about? This is all happening so fast. We can't be talking about marriage already." The king's voice was steady but firm. "Find someone when you already have your betrothed? You don't have to worry about finding someone. Princess Kedi, The daughter of King Acho from the powerful kingdom of Umundi has been waiting for you. She has grown into a beautiful maiden, and your marriage to her will strengthen our bonds and bring security and prosperity to our people." Dozier's heart sank. "No, father," he said, shaking his head. "This tradition of choosing a wife for children who know nothing is long outdated. How do you even know what I want in a woman? I believe I should have the right to choose my own bride. If I am to do this, it should be my choice." His voice grew tense, his frustration showing. His mother's face softened, but her words were unyielding. "Dozier, you do not speak to your father in that tone. You may not understand it now, but we are doing what is best for you and our kingdom. Princess Kedi is a beautiful woman, and you will meet her in 2 days. She has been waiting to see you. This tradition did not begin with you. Look at me. This was how I got married to your father, and we've lived happily since then." The weight of the conversation pressed heavily on Dozier's shoulders. The evening, which had begun so joyfully, now felt ruined. He felt his chest tighten, as if the walls were closing in on him. "Father, mother," he said, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry, but I need to step outside for a moment." Without waiting for their response, he rose from the table and hurried out of the dining hall, his heart pounding as he made his way into the fresh evening air. The queen turned to the king, her eyes filled with concern. "Don't you think we might be pushing him too hard?" she asked softly. The king gave a small nod, but his gaze remained resolute. "He is so young, my dear, but he will understand in time. Princess Kedi is a kind and very beautiful woman. Once he meets her, I'm sure he will come around." Meanwhile, Nnenna and Sinachi sat together under a shady tree in the palace garden, enjoying the cool evening breeze. They had both finished their work for the day and were eager to catch up on the latest palace gossip. Nnenna, the chief cook's lively daughter, often helped her mother in the kitchen, while Sinachi was the queen's personal maid, a role she held dearly. Despite being adults now, they had been best friends since they were little girls, sharing secrets, laughter, and dreams. Sinachi had a special place in the palace. Her mother had passed away when she was very young, and her father, who had worked as a palace gardener for many years, had also passed. When he died, the queen, fond of Sinachi, took her in and made her her personal maid. As the two friends sat under the tree, Nena's eyes sparkled with excitement. She leaned in closer, unable to hold back her secret any longer. "Guess what?" she said, barely able to contain herself. "I saw the prince up close today when I served dinner. Oh, Sinachi, he's so incredibly handsome. I mean, he's the most stunning man I've ever seen." Sinachi didn't reply right away. Ever since she had been in the prince's room earlier, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her. His gaze had been so intense, so searching, that it left her feeling nervous and confused. What could Prince Dozier, a royal, possibly see in an ordinary maid like herself? Definitely, she knew there was no way he could be admiring her. After she left his room, she had found a mirror and studied her reflection, wondering if something was wrong with her appearance. But no, she looked just the same as always. Lost in thought, she didn't even realize Nnenna was waiting for her to respond until she felt a gentle nudge. "Sinachi," Nnenna whispered, jolting her back to the present. Why aren't you saying anything? Oh, yes, Sinachi said, trying to focus. He's very handsome, Nina. Really, he is, she nodded, agreeing with her friend, but her thoughts were still miles away. Nina leaned in closer, lowering her voice, as if she were sharing the most thrilling secret. Listen, my mother overheard the king and queen talking a few weeks ago. They want the prince to marry soon. Her eyes danced with excitement as she added, the prince is exactly my type, Sinachi. I am thinking of taking my chances and trying to win his attention. What do you think? Sinachi's eyes went wide with shock. Are you serious, Nina? Have you lost your mind? She whispered, glancing around. Did you really think the prince would be interested in girls like us? Nina shrugged, undeterred. Well, you never know. Someone has to try, right? Who knows if I may get lucky. He's also betrothed to someone already, Osinachi pointed out. I know that, Neka replied with a wicked grin. I also know that he doesn't like her. Sinachi shook her head, a mix of disbelief and amusement on her face. All right then, she said with a faint smile. Good luck with that, but don't say I didn't warn you. She stood up, feeling strangely unsettled. Her mind kept drifting back to the prince's gaze, and she couldn't shake the odd feeling it left with her. I think I'll go to bed early, Nena. I'm feeling a bit under the weather. Oh, please take care of yourself, Nena said, looking up at her friend with concern. I'll see you tomorrow. Good night. As Sinachi walked away, Nena leaned back under the tree, gazing up at the stars that dotted the night sky. She allowed herself to imagine a different life, a life where she caught the prince's eyes, where he chose her, and where she would become the queen someday. Smiling broadly, she made up her mind right there and then. I won't let this chance slip by, she whispered to herself. I will do everything I can to win his heart, and when he marries me, I will be the queen of Omenka. The thought filled her with such excitement that she hugged her knees close to her chest, dreaming of a future that felt so close, yet so far. The days seemed to fly by, each one bringing Prince Dozier closer to the moment he had been dreading. He sat alone in his room, dressed in his finest royal attire, holding a glass of wine as he awaited the arrival of Princess Kedi from the Umundi kingdom and her family. He remembered seeing her when she was still little. Other than that, he had no memory of her. He sighed, feeling a knot of frustration in his chest. Since that tense dinner night with his parents, he couldn't stop questioning this decision. How could they expect him to marry someone he barely knew, all for the sake of duty and tradition? He felt trapped in a life where his wants and needs seemed to come second to everyone else's. Royalty had always been about putting the people's well-being above his own. But he wondered, for how long could he live like this? As the thought swelled, a soft knock interrupted him, and his mother, the queen, entered his room. Dozier, dear, they've arrived, she said gently, studying his face with a hint of suspicion. Her eyes landed on the glass of wine in his hand. Have you been drinking already? I'm fine, mother, he replied, managing a small smile. I will join you shortly. The queen stepped closer, gently taking the glass from him. This is for the best, my son. Once you meet her, you will see that she's everything we need in a future queen. She's lovely, well-educated, and perfectly suited for the palace life. Together, you two would make fine leaders. She gave him a soft, encouraging smile. Now, come along. We mustn't keep such honorable guests waiting. Dozier took a deep breath, nodding, as he followed her out of the room. The dining hall was already set with a grand table, laden with food and decorated with bright flowers. As he entered, he could hear laughter echoing through the room, voices mingling in cheerful conversation. Just as he stepped in, he spotted her, the maid from the other night. She was busy arranging something on the table, her movements graceful and light. For a brief moment, the noise and worry in his mind quieted. He felt a strange calm wash over him. Ever since he had returned, even amid all the tension, he had found himself thinking of her, her gentle smile, the quiet strength in her eyes. Somehow, her presence felt like a refuge, even if she had no idea how deeply she affected him. What is wrong with me, he wondered, snapping himself back to the moment. He had responsibilities, guests waiting, and he couldn't let his mind wander. As everyone's eyes turned to him, he gave a slight bow and took his seat. That was when he noticed the beautiful young woman seated next to him, looking at him with a friendly smile. This must be Princess Kedi, he thought, feeling a weight settle back on his shoulders. You've grown into such a fine young man, King Arthur said warmly, beaming at him. The last time I saw you, you were still just a boy. We are counting on you to make us proud. Dozier smiled politely, nodding in acknowledgement. What did they expect him to say? His mind was still swelling with mixed emotions. As lunch continued, the room filled with laughter, friendly voices, and cheerful clinking of dishes. Everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves, diving into lively conversations, but he could barely touch his food. Every few moments, he felt Princess Kedi's gaze upon him, her eyes studying him with an eager interest that made him feel uneasy. She was beautiful, and she seemed kind, but he didn't feel anything for her, not even a spark. The meal dragged on, each passing moment reminding him of the expectations pressing down on him. After lunch, the queen gently suggested that Prince Dozier and Princess Kedi take a walk together. She hoped that some time alone might help them connect, allowing them to get to know each other beyond formalities. The two walked in silence through the palace gardens, surrounded by blooming flowers and the gentle rustle of leaves. Eventually, they settled under a large tree, its shade casting a cool shelter over them. But even as they sat side by side, the silence lingered, thick and uncomfortable. Dozier had nothing to say, his thoughts a tangled mess of emotions he couldn't yet put into words. Finally, after a long pause, Kedi couldn't bear the quiet any longer. She looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Did I not meet your expectations?" she asked, her voice soft with a hint of worry. The sadness in her tone stirred something in Dozier, making him feel a pang of guilt. "No, this has nothing to do with you," he replied gently. I need time to process everything that's happening," he spoke softly, hoping to ease the tension between them. Kedi studied him for a moment. Then she spoke again, her gaze sharp and curious. "Is this about the maid?" she asked, her tone now tinged with suspicion. Dozier's brows furrowed in confusion. "What about the maid?" he asked, feeling a bit defensive. "Oh, don't think I didn't notice," Kedi continued, her voice growing firmer. I saw the way you looked at her when you walked into the dining room. It was as if no one else in the room even existed. Her words were urged with hurt, but her gaze held a spark of anger. Dozier closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "Please," he said in a calm, pleading tone. "I'm going through so much right now, and I don't want to start this relationship with arguments." Katie's eyes flashed as she interrupted, her voice rising. "She is just a maid, Dozier. She has nothing to offer you. I am the best fit for you. We should be focusing on each other, on our future together, not on a slutty, dirty servant." Her voice grew louder, filled with frustration. "I have been waiting for you for years. Did you even think this is easy for me?" she cried out, her voice carrying both anger and a hint of desperation. Dozier felt his patience fraying. "You know what?" he said, standing abruptly, his gaze steady but pained. "I think I have had enough of this." He straightened, looking down at her with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "I've heard everything you said, Princess, and it's not my fault that you've been waiting. Right now, I need a break." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing beneath the tree. Katie watched him go, her fist clenched, her face flushed with anger and disbelief. No one had ever spoken to her like that, let alone walked away from her. The worst part was that from the moment she had seen him, she had fallen deeply in love. He was everything she had dreamed in a man: handsome, strong, and calm. And she would stop at nothing to make him hers, no matter what it took. Later that night, under the blanket of stars twinkling in the sky, Prince Dozier sat alone in the quiet corner of the palace garden, a bottle of wine in his hand. He had been drinking for a while, his mind weighed down by everything happening around him. Just hours earlier, he had a tense argument with his father about the arranged marriage to Princess Katie. She was beautiful, and by all accounts a fitting match for him, but he felt nothing for her. What he truly wanted was time to settle back into his home, to heal from his broken heart, and maybe venture into mechanized farming, something he had carefully saved for during his years abroad. Marriage was the last thing on his mind, not after what had happened with the woman he once loved. Memories of that painful past flooded his mind. He had given his heart, his time, his loyalty, everything to a girl he thought he would spend his life with. He had even stayed away from home because her family refused to let her return back home with him. And he loved her so deeply that he was willing to sacrifice everything just to be with her. But then the unthinkable happened. She betrayed him. He discovered with a crushing heartbreak that she was pregnant with another man's child. The betrayal had shattered him, leaving scars he wasn't sure would ever heal. That was when he realized that he had nothing left to stay abroad for, and decided to return home to his people in Omenka, hoping for a fresh start. But now, instead of peace, he found himself losing control, torn between a maid who had unexpectedly captured his heart and a marriage his family had already planned for him. He took another long gulp of wine, hoping that just for a moment, it would dull the pain and quiet his restless thoughts. He felt overwhelmed, trapped by duty and haunted by memories he couldn't forget. The palace had grown quiet, as everyone had retired to bed. Osinachi, the queen's maid, was tidying up the living room before heading to her quarters when she noticed Prince Dozie staggering in, reeking of alcohol. His eyes were glassy, and he could barely stand straight. She recognized that he was drunk. Concerned, she walked over to him and gently took the bottle of wine from his hand, feeling the weight of his sadness. Without a word, she placed an arm around him, guiding him carefully down the hall and helping him to his room. Once there, she helped him onto his bed, her hands gentle as she laid him down. Then, she went to fetch a bowl of cold water and a cloth. She dabbed his forehead and face with a damp cloth, applying a light pressure to ease his discomfort. Slowly, she saw his tense expression relax, his breathing calming as he settled into the bed. He seemed so vulnerable, so different from the vibrant prince she knew. She couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to drink so much. Just as she was about to leave, his hand reached out, holding her back. "Please, don't go," he whispered, his voice soft and pleading. Osinachi froze, taken aback by his words. Her heart raced as she glanced down at him, seeing something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. A deep loneliness, a longing she couldn't fully understand. She hesitated. What if someone found her in the prince's room? But his grip was firm, and as she looked at him lying there, his face calm and his eyes filled with an unspoken sadness, she felt a pang of pity. What could he be going through? She couldn't bring herself to leave him alone just yet. Gently, she sat back on the edge of his bed, watching over him as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. For a moment, everything felt still and calm. Finally, when she was sure he was resting, she slipped quietly out of the room, her heart racing as she tiptoed down the hall, hoping no one would see her. What she didn't know was that someone actually saw her. Nina had been watching every single thing happening in the palace, her eyes always sharp, her ears always listening. Her dream of becoming the queen was making her so desperate, and she was willing to do anything to be the queen. Sitting alone in her usual spot in the palace garden, Nina let her thoughts wander, trying to come up with plans on how to approach the prince. She stared at the flowers, but barely saw them, her mind spinning with different thoughts. Suddenly, she noticed something that made her heart race. Prince Dozie was stumbling towards the palace doors, looking unsteady and lost. She squinted, realizing he was drunk, and a spark of hope lit up in her chest. Maybe this was her chance. If she could offer him comfort, maybe he would notice her. Maybe even appreciate her kindness. Quickly, she rose from her spot and hurried inside the palace, her mind racing with possibilities. She imagined what she might say, how she might gently help him and make him see her in a new way. But as soon as she stepped inside, she froze. There, right before her eyes, was Osinachi. She was gently guiding the prince, helping him to his room with a careful and kind touch. Nina's hands clenched into fists, and anger bubbled up inside her. That sneaky girl, she thought. her mind whirling. How dare she ruin my chance? Could it be that Osinachi is also interested in the prince? The thought filled Nena with jealousy and a fierce anger. She wasn't going to let anyone take what she believed was meant for her. Never. Not even if that person was Osinachi. Hiding in the shadows, Nena watched as Osinachi led the prince to his room. And then, after a long while, she came out and headed to her own quarters. Nena's chest tightened as she watched her friend disappear into the darkness, anger filling her heart. She couldn't believe that her friend, the one she had trusted, was the one standing in her way. Meanwhile, in her room, Osinachi lay on the bed but sleep wouldn't come. The events of the night played over and over in her mind. She remembered the way Prince Dozie had looked at her, the way he had held her hand and pleaded softly for her to stay with him. His voice had sounded so sad, so full of a need she didn't fully understand. His words lingered in her mind, leaving her feeling both confused and strangely comforted. Slowly, her eyes grew heavy, and she drifted into a quiet sleep, her thoughts still filled with the prince's face and voice. The next morning, as Osinachi quietly cleared the dining table, she suddenly heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned and found herself looking right into Prince Dozier's eyes. Her heart raced, and she quickly looked away, hoping desperately that he wouldn't remember anything from the previous night. Surely he wouldn't. He had been so heavily drunk. But then she heard his voice, soft and warm. "Greetings, my beautiful lady." Surprised, Osinachi turned back and bowed her head slightly, her cheeks turning pink. She hadn't expected him to speak to her, especially not with such kindness in his voice. The prince watched her for a moment, studying her as though he was seeing something new and precious. Then, with a suddenness that startled her, he asked, "Will you go horse riding with me?" Originally, he had planned to ride alone, to clear his mind, but something about her presence made him want company. Felt an urge to spend more time around her. Osinachi blinked in surprise, unsure of where this request was coming from. She hesitated. I'm not sure, my prince." "There is nothing to worry about," he said gently, almost pleading. "I will protect you. Please, don't say no." His words were so sincere, convincing and full of warmth that Osinachi felt her heart soften. She found herself nodding, despite the questions swirling in her mind. She had finished her chores for the morning, but what would others think? And why was the prince suddenly so interested in her company? Prince Dozier took her hand, leading her outside towards the stables. As they walked, he looked over at her and asked, "Have you ever ridden a horse before?" "No, my prince," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then, today, I will teach you," he said, his smile warm and inviting. "When I was away from home, whenever I missed Omenka, horse riding made me feel close to it. It always helped me feel at peace." Osinachi returned his smile, a mix of nervousness and excitement fluttering inside her. She wasn't sure why he was being so kind, but his gentle words made her feel safe. They mounted a horse together, and in no time, they were riding through the open forest, the wind rushing past them. Osinachi clung to the prince tightly, feeling the powerful rhythm of the horse beneath her. She had never felt so free. The trees seemed to blow around them, and for a moment, all her worries melted away. She couldn't believe this was happening, that she was sharing such an incredible moment with the prince himself. After some time, they slowed near the base of a mountain. Together, they climbed up to a high spot where they sat down, gazing out over the valley as the sun rose higher, casting a warm golden light over the land. Osinachi couldn't help but still glances at the prince. His face was bright with joy as he took in the view, his eyes filled with wonder, as if the simple beauty of the morning brought him peace. Seeing him like this, she felt a quiet happiness, that its sadness from yesterday had faded, even if just for a while. Breaking the silence, Prince Ozier's voice came softly. "How long have you worked here as my mother's maid?" "I've been in the palace for long," she said, "but officially I've worked for the queen for 5 years," she replied gently, "since my father passed away." His expression softened. "I'm so sorry to hear that," he replied, sympathy in his tone. "And your mother, does she live somewhere in the village?" Osinachi shook her head, her voice soft. "No, she died when I was very young. I didn't really get to know her." The prince's face fell slightly as he imagined the loneliness she must be feeling. "This must be very hard," he said quietly, his voice full of compassion. Osinachi nodded, giving him a brave smile. "It is, but the palace has become my home. I have found people here who care about me, especially the queen." They continued talking, letting the conversation flow easily from one topic to the next. The prince shared stories of his time away, making Osinachi laugh at his little jokes, and he couldn't help but to watch her closely, captivated by her calm beauty and gentle spirit. Her laughter was soft, and her eyes sparkled with kindness, a quality he hadn't expected, but that now seemed impossible to ignore. He knew Princess Kedi awaited him back at the palace, the woman his parents had chosen for him, the one he was bound by tradition to marry. Yet he was here, drawn to a simple maid who had, without even trying, slipped quietly into his heart. When the sun rose high in the sky, Prince Ozier sighed, knowing it was time to return. They rode back to the palace, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him, something he wasn't sure he wanted to let go of. The queen was sitting in the palace living room with Princess Kedi when Prince Dozier entered. He greeted his mother warmly, but he didn't even glance in Kedi's direction. Just seeing her filled him with anger and frustration, and he quickly turned to head to his room. But before he could leave, his mother called out to him. "Where have you been, Dozier? Kedi has been here waiting for you." "I went horse riding," he replied, trying to keep his voice calm, though irritation was clear in his tone. "I wasn't expecting her to be here." "Well, it's good she came," the queen said, ignoring the frown on her son's face. "You both need to spend more time together. It's important for you two to get to know each other." Prince Ozier forced a nod. "I'll be in my room," he said, barely hiding his annoyance. As he left the living room, what had started as a good day suddenly felt ruined. Kedi was a constant reminder of the life his parents had chosen for him, a life he didn't want. Once he was back in his room, he poured himself a glass of wine and stood by the window. downing the drink in one quick gulp. He poured a second, then a third, hoping the alcohol would calm his mind. All he wanted was something, anything that could ease his pain and bring him even a little peace. He was in the middle of his third glass when the door swung open, and there stood Kedi, her presence filling the room and making his frustration flare even hotter. He narrowed his eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tense with anger. Kedi stepped closer, giving him a soft, almost taunting smile. "Should I assume you have a drinking problem?" Prince Dozie shot her an irritated look. "And how exactly is that any of your business?" Kedi didn't back down. "As a matter of fact, it should be," she replied coolly. "You will be king, and the king is not expected to be a drunk. The other day, you came down for lunch, and it was obvious you had been drinking. You reeked of alcohol. Thank goodness my parents didn't notice." "That's only because they are so desperate to get you married off," he snapped back, taking a step closer until they were face to face. "But listen closely, Kedi. I feel nothing for you. Absolutely nothing. If I were you, I would go back to my kingdom and find someone who loves me, because this," he gestured between them, "is never going to work." He turned back to the window, his voice quieter but firm. "I have tried to deny it, to fight it, but I can't ignore what's in my heart anymore. I'm in love with someone else, even though I don't want to." The words slipped out before he could stop himself, and he regretted them the moment he saw the look of shock on Kedi's face. "What?" she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "What are you saying, Dozie? I have waited for you to come back for years, and now you stand here and tell me you don't love me." Her voice broke and she screamed, unable to contain her anger and heartbreak. "It's not my fault," Gozie shouted back, his frustration boiling over. "I was never part of this arrangement. It was made without my consent." He softened his tone, trying to reason with her. "Please, Kedi, let's not allow our parents to use us for their own selfish ambitions or pin some crazy tradition on us. We're adults. We should marry for love." Kedi shook her head, her face pale with hurt. "No, no one is using me, Dozie. I love you. I have loved you since we were children, and have dreamed my whole life of being your wife." Prince Dozie stood in stunned silence, watching the pain and determination in her eyes. Slowly, Kedi stepped closer, her gaze softening, and before he could react, she reached out, wrapping her arms around him, her face inches from his. He could see the longing in her eyes, feel the warmth of her touch as she leaned in, trying to kiss him. But just as quickly, he pulled away, snapping back to reality. "You need to leave now," he said firmly, pointing towards the door. "Please, Dozie." "No, Kedi. Leave," he repeated, his voice louder, more final. Kedi's face twisted with anger as she looked at him, her eyes burning with resentment. "You are going to regret this," she hissed, before storming out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Prince Dozie slumped on his bed, his hands pressed against his forehead as he gulped down more wine, hoping to numb the frustration bubbling inside him. But just as he tried to drown his thoughts, the door burst open and his mother strode in, her face tight with anger. "I just saw Kedi running out of the palace in tears," the queen said sharply. "What happened?" "I hope she never comes back," Lucy replied coldly, the words slipping out before he could hold them back. The queen's face hardened, her eyes narrowing as she studied her son. She took a deep breath, steadying her voice. "Dozier, you don't understand what you are throwing away. The dream of every true king is power. You need power to protect your people. Umundi is one of the most powerful kingdoms, and we've had a strong alliance with them for many years. Marrying Kedi would not only strengthen that alliance, but would also secure your throne. Don't you see? This marriage is more than feelings. It's about your future, about the future of Omenka. With or without Kedi, I will be a good king," Gozie argued, his voice low but steady. "But I can't marry someone I don't love, mother. Please, try to understand. I feel nothing for her." The queen's expression softened only slightly, but her voice held a steely resolve. "You don't have a choice, Dozie. She's a beautiful girl, well suited for the palace, and in time you will grow to love her. Prepare yourself, son. In 8 market days, this union will be sealed. Kedi has waited long enough." "No, mother," Dozie shouted as she turned to leave. "I don't want this." But the queen walked out without another word, her mind made up, leaving him standing alone in his room, a heavy silence filling the space she had left behind. For the rest of the day, Prince Dozie stayed in his room, drinking glass after glass, trying to block out the storm of thoughts raging in his mind. But no matter how much he drank, he couldn't escape the heavy feeling inside him. His thoughts wouldn't leave him. They stood before him, unmovable, as if reminding him that this was his reality now, the life he couldn't run from, no matter how hard he tried to blur it out. Osinachi couldn't help but wonder what was going on with the prince. Since they had returned from their outing, he hadn't left his room. She had noticed the tense look on the queen's face when she had walked out of his chambers, and it made her curious. The prince hadn't eaten all day, and though she didn't quite understand why, she found herself worrying about him. Why did she care so much? She tried to ignore it, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. As the night fell, and the palace grew quiet, she made up her mind to bring him something to eat. After all, he had been kind to her, and perhaps she could be there for him too. But in her heart, she knew there was more to it than that. She was beginning to feel something special for the prince, feelings she hadn't expected. She moved carefully through the quiet hallways, carrying a tray of food up to his room. When she reached the door, she knocked softly, waiting for a response, but there was no answer. After a moment, she decided to push the door open, and what she saw shocked her. The room was scattered with empty bottles of wine, and the prince was sitting by his window, still drinking, his eyes staring out with a deep, sad expression. No, she thought firmly. He can't keep doing this to himself. She set the food tray down and started to gather the empty bottles, clearing the room bit by bit. Then, she went to the small bar in his room, gathering all the remaining bottles of alcohol and carrying them downstairs. determined to remove every last drop. He needed to stop drowning in drink and face whatever was troubling him. When she finished, she quietly approached him. "My prince," she said softly. He hadn't noticed her until that moment. At the sound of her voice, he turned, his eyes meeting hers with a mix of surprise and longing. Gently, she took the bottle from his hand, moving it out of his reach. "You've had enough for today," she said, her voice filled with concern. "You can't keep doing this to yourself. Do you want to kill yourself?" Something about her voice calmed him, the soft, caring tone breaking through his sadness. He looked at her closely, noticing how beautiful she looked in the dim light of his room, her face filled with kindness. Before he knew it, he had closed the space between them, tracing the lines of her face with his fingers, his arms slipping around her waist. Without thinking, he leaned down and kissed her. Osinachi's heart skipped a beat. She knew she should stop him, but she couldn't just pull away. In that moment, they both surrendered to the feelings they had tried to hide, consumed in each other's warmth. It was later, in the stillness of the night, that Osinachi's eyes fluttered open. She lay in the prince's bed, the memories of what had happened washing over her. What had she done? She had slept with the prince, something she never imagined to happen. Panic began to rise within her as she thought of the consequences. If anyone found out, she would be in serious trouble. She glanced at the prince, who was still fast asleep beside her. Moving quickly and quietly, she dressed and slipped out of the room, her heart pounding. No one could ever know what had happened between them. She told herself he wouldn't remember anyway. He had been so drunk. The soft golden glow of the morning sun streamed through the window, gently waking Prince Dozier. As he opened his eyes, he winced, feeling a sharp pounding headache. He groaned, pressing a hand to his forehead, remembering just how much he had drunk the night before. His body felt heavy and his mind clouded. Every beat of his heart seemed to make his head ache. Slowly, he forced himself to sit up, hoping to reach for a glass of water to ease his thirst. But just as he moved, his eyes fell on a figure lying beside him on the bed. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Who was she? His mind spun with questions. How had she ended up here? He looked closer, trying to make sense of it. His memory of the night was hazy, but he recalled being with a woman he thought was Osinachi. Could she have left and someone else taken her place? He leaned over and lightly shook her shoulder. She stared, then sat up suddenly, looking frightened. He recognized her vaguely. She was one of the palace maids. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion and frustration. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stammered, "My prince, I came to bring you food last night. And you told me you loved me. Then you..." Her voice broke as tears streamed down her face. "You slept with me." The prince's eyes widened, and he felt his headache worsen. All he could remember was Osinachi's face, her calm voice. But now, nothing made sense. Had he really mistaken this maiden for Osinachi in his drunken state? His heart sank as he realized the terrible mistake he might have made. His hands clenched as he tried to process the mess he had gotten himself into. "Please," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Let's keep this between us. No one needs to know. Tell me what you want. Anything. I will give it to you." But she shook her head, her voice trembling. "I want nothing, my prince. You were my first. I have never been with any man before you. You told me you loved me," she sobbed. "And now, you're saying you want this kept as a secret. And you're also offering to pay me off." He glanced down and noticed the blood on the sheets, confirming her words. Guilt and dread settled heavy on him. What had he done? He took a deep breath, feeling a pang of pity for the young maiden before him. "I didn't know what I was doing. I was so drunk," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "Please, just give me a little time to process all of this." She nodded slowly, wiping her tears as she stood up and left the room, giving him space to grapple with the situation. As she stepped out of the prince's chambers, a small sly smile crept across Nena's face. She had succeeded. Now, nothing would stop the prince from marrying her. She had seen the guilt and shock on his face, and knew that he believed her story completely. Nena's plan had started the night before, when she had seen Osinachi sneak into the prince's room with a tray of food, and she waited, hiding in the shadows to see what would happen. She watched as Osinachi took away the bottles of wine from his room, realizing that the prince was indeed drunk. She waited patiently, knowing that this might be the chance she had been hoping for. It took a very long time, and she was finally dozing off when, at midnight, she saw Osinachi slip out of the prince's room. Perfect, she thought, her mind racing with possibilities. She waited a little longer, then entered the prince's room herself, lying down beside him. She knew he was too drunk to know the difference and would believe her story in the morning. The blood on the sheets was all the proof she needed. Now, he would think she was the woman he had been with, and he would feel bound to her. Her plan had worked, and she was one step closer to becoming the queen. For several days, Prince Dozier stayed shut away in his room, too unwell to leave his bed. He had fallen sick, and the palace had called a doctor to care for him. Each day, the doctor came, giving him medicine and checking his progress. The prince's body was weak, but his mind was restless, filled with thoughts of Osinachi. The memory of her gentle smile, her soft laugh, and the way she looked at him brought him a strange sense of comfort. He longed to see her, to hear her voice, to spend time with her. But day after day, she didn't come to check on him, and he began to wonder why. He thought they had become friends, that perhaps she cared for him as he did for her. That evening, the doctor had just finished his visit when the door suddenly swung open, and Nena stepped into the room. The prince felt his heart skip a beat, a reminder of the mess he had gotten himself into that night. "My prince," Nena greeted, her voice sounding anxious. "I heard you were sick, so I came to see how you were doing." The prince nodded slightly, trying to hide his discomfort. "Thank you, Nena. I'm feeling a bit better," he replied softly. "Is there anything I can do for you?" she asked, stepping closer, her voice laced with concern. A hot plate of soup could be of help. Prince Jose shook his head gently. No, thank you. I appreciate your kindness, but I'd rather be alone right now. A brief sadness flickered across Nena's face, but she nodded. As you wish, my prince. I will be here if you ever need me. She gave him a faint smile before turning and leaving the room. As Nena exited the prince's chamber, Osinachi spotted her and paused, her heart twisting with worry. She hadn't dared to visit the prince since that night. She didn't know if he remembered or how he might react if they saw each other again. Her feelings for him had only grown stronger, but she was filled with doubt. She was just a maid, while he was a prince, betrothed to a beautiful princess. She knew she was no match for Princess Kedi, and she tried to convince herself that she should forget whatever had happened between them. But it was hard. Her heart still held on to a thin hope. Nena noticed her staring and walked over with a friendly smile. Osinachi, you look like you've just seen a ghost, she teased lightly. Are you wondering why I was in the prince's room? No, Osinachi replied quickly, her cheeks turning pink. I don't care. Oh, is that so? Nena replied with a smirk. I was starting to think you had feelings for the prince too. She paused, lowering her voice. But since you're my friend, I will tell you a secret. Come with me. Curious but nervous, Osinachi followed Nena out to the palace garden. Once they were alone, Nena leaned in, glancing around as if to make sure no one could hear her. The prince confessed his love for me, she whispered, her voice full of pride. I'm telling you this because you are my closest friend. The other night, he made love to me, she finished, with a satisfied smile. Osinachi's eyes widened in shock, her heart sinking. What? Wait, you mean? Yes, Nena interrupted, her smile widening. I thought you'd be happy for me. Tears filled Osinachi's eyes, her heart breaking into pieces. She forced a smile, trying to keep her composure. Yes, I'm happy. Very happy for you, she said, her voice shaking. I have something I need to do. Excuse me. Before Nena could say another word, Osinachi turned and ran, her feet barely touching the ground, as she raced back to her room. Once inside, she shut the door and let her tears fall, her whole body shaking with pain. She had thought she meant something to Prince Dozie, that there was a spark of hope between them, but she had only been foolish. How had she let herself believe that something could happen between them? She was just a maid and he was a prince. The memory of that night filled her with regret. He had been so drunk and she had let herself into believing that it meant something. But hearing that he had declared his love to Nena shattered her. She had held onto the tiniest hope, but now all was gone. She cried until there were no tears left, her heart feeling as though it would never mend. Meanwhile, Nena was filled with excitement as she walked through the palace. Everything was going exactly as she planned. The prince was trapped in guilt, and Osinachi's heart was broken. Now, nothing can stand in our way. Soon enough, she would be the queen. The days passed quickly, and at last Prince Dozie had fully recovered. Yet, despite his return to health, something weighed heavily on his mind. He kept looking for Osinachi, hoping to catch her eyes, to exchange even a few words with her. But whenever he saw her, she was always busy, focused on her task, as if he wasn't there. At night, He would see her quietly making her way to her quarters, never glancing his way. He began to believe she didn't care for him at all. That to her, he was just the prince and nothing more. But no matter how distant she seemed, his feelings for her only grew stronger each day, until he knew he couldn't hold them back any longer. He had to tell her how he felt. That evening, as Osinachi was making her way back to the servants' quarters, the prince stepped forward, gently blocking her path. "Osinachi," he said softly, his voice laced with hope and hesitation, "I would like to speak with you for a while." She kept her gaze down, her expression closed off, but he thought he caught a glimpse of sadness in her eyes. Her silence made his heart ache, but he wasn't ready to give up. "Please," he whispered, almost pleading. Osinachi knew she should refuse him. She should turn and walk away. She wanted to be angry, to say the harsh words she had rehearsed in her mind over and over, but no words came. Was this what it felt like to be in love? Finally, unable to resist, she nodded and followed him to a quiet spot in the palace garden, where the soft glow of lanterns surrounded them. Once they were alone, Prince Dozier turned to her, his face filled with worry. "Is there something wrong?" he asked gently. "It feels like you've been avoiding me. You didn't even come to check on me when I was ill. I thought we were friends." His voice sounded so sincere, so hot, that it softened Osinachi's heart. For a moment, all the bitterness, all the pain and anger she had been holding on to faded. This was the Dozier she had fallen in love with, the man who had shown her kindness when she least expected it. He took a step closer, searching her face, his voice low and filled with emotion. "Can't you tell already? Can't you hear the sound of my heart beating for you? Can't you see that I am in love with you? I have tried to push these feelings away, but I can't. I can't get you out of my mind." His gaze was intense, his eyes burning with a passion he could no longer hide. Slowly he reached out, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her close. And then, unable to stop himself, he leaned down and kissed her passionately, pouring all his feelings into that moment. But after a few seconds, Osinachi pulled away, her eyes wide with fear. "No, no, I shouldn't be doing this," she said, her voice trembling. Her mind raced with all the reasons why this could never work. Without another word, she turned and ran, her heart pounding as she fled from the garden. Prince Dozier stood there watching her disappear into the shadows, his heart breaking. Did I do something wrong? He wondered, still feeling the sting of rejection. He had opened up to her, let her see his deepest feelings, but now he was left alone. After a while, he turned and walked slowly back to his chambers, his heart heavy with sorrow and confusion. As Prince Dozier lay on his bed trying to calm his racing mind, he suddenly heard his door creak open. He looked up and to his surprise, saw Nena entering the room. Without hesitation, she climbed onto his bed, reaching out to touch his chest, her fingers moving in slow, soft circles. Her eyes sparkled with a sly smile as she tried to pull him closer. Her intentions were clear. She had come to seduce him. But he felt nothing but irritation. And quickly, he pushed her away, leaping to his feet. "What are you doing here?" he snapped, his voice sharp with anger. "What do you want from me?" Nena's smile didn't falter. She looked at him with a sweetness that seemed almost practiced. "My prince, ever since that night, I haven't stopped thinking about you," she murmured, her voice soft and sweet. "I love you so much and I long to feel your touch again." The prince shook his head firmly. "No, I want you to leave now." He pointed towards the door, his face set in a hard expression. A look of hurt crossed Nena's face and her eyes began to fill with tears. "You can't treat me like this, my prince," she said, her voice trembling. "You took away my innocence. You told me you loved me, and now I am in love with you, that I can't even hold back myself anymore." She let a tear slip down her cheek, as if hoping it would soften him. Prince Zozier's jaw tightened as he took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "That night was a mistake," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I am sorry it happened, and I will do whatever it takes to make it right. But there is nothing between us. I feel nothing for you, and I wish that night never happened. I was drunk and didn't know what I was doing." At this, Nena's expression changed, a flicker of anger flashing across her face. "Is this about her?" she asked, her voice suddenly cold. "Who?" the prince asked, frowning, his curiosity piqued. "Never mind," Nena said quickly, her voice hardening. "But remember, I don't want anything from you except to be your queen. That's all." His face darkened as he pointed to the door once more. "Get out. Now." Nena glared at him, her face a mixture of anger and determination. "I will go, but I won't let you use me and toss me aside," she said defiantly. With that, she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The weeks flew by, and the preparations for Prince Zozier's marriage were in full swing at the palace. The big day was drawing closer, and yet the prince's heart and mind were far from the celebration. He had tried as hard as he could to focus on his upcoming marriage, but his thoughts kept drifting to Osinachi. Every time he saw her around the palace, she would quickly turn away, avoiding his gaze and keeping her distance. She refused to speak to him, and though it hurt, his feelings for her were growing deeper. He couldn't understand what had gone wrong, why she was acting this way. Something wasn't right, but every attempt he made to speak with her failed. Finally, Prince Zozier decided he needed to turn his attention to his own dreams and ambitions. He threw himself into plans for a new project, starting up his own farms. He purchased acres of land, diving into the work of preparing the fields. He thought that maybe, if he busied himself, he could settle his mind and stop thinking of Osinachi, who seemed determined to keep her distance. He reminded himself that love couldn't be forced. Perhaps his parents had been right all along. He had been hurt by love not once but twice, and though he still wasn't excited about his arranged marriage to Princess Kedi, he began to think that it might not be such a bad idea after all. Seeing his son's resolve, the king was overjoyed and offered his full support. He provided the best lands for the prince's new project, ensuring that every step of the way was set up for success. Slowly, Prince Zozier's days began to fill with purpose again, and things in the palace seemed to fall back into place. The farm was coming together, and it appeared that life was beginning to look normal once again, even if his heart still felt the ache of unspoken love. One morning, as Queen Ochendu was sorting through her clothes in preparation for the upcoming marriage, Osinachi helped quietly by her side. Suddenly, Osinachi stopped, her face going pale, as she pressed a hand to her mouth and hurriedly rushed out of the room. Moments later, she returned, looking exhausted and unsteady. The queen watched her with a raised eyebrow, noticing something strange. She had observed small changes in Osinachi over the past few days. Fatigue, a touch of queasiness. She had brushed it off before, but now suspicion sparked in her mind. "Are you pregnant?" the queen asked, her voice calm but direct. Osinachi's eyes widened in shock. No, your majesty," she stammered, her face flushing as she looked away. She had been feeling ill for days, plagued by nausea and fatigue. But the thought of being pregnant had never crossed her mind. The queen kept her gaze steady. "You don't look well, Osinachi," she said firmly. "Go and rest now. I'll finish up here." "Thank you, your majesty," Osinachi murmured gratefully, her heart pounding as she turned to leave. As she made her way out of the queen's chamber, her mind spun with worry. She had never imagined that her illness could mean pregnancy. But now the queen's words echoed in her mind, filling her with fear. If it were true, if she was pregnant, it would be a great disaster, and the queen would be so disappointed in her. The palace had been her only home since her father's death. Where would she go? What would she do? And with Prince Dozier set to marry in just a few days, this would only complicate things even more. As she reached the door, she crossed paths with Nena, who greeted her with a stiff, polite nod. Osinachi barely managed a smile before continuing to her quarters, feeling as if the weight of the world were pressing down on her. For the past few weeks, Nena had been sitting with frustration. All her efforts, her schemes, everything she had done to catch the prince's eye had failed. The prince had made it clear that he had no interest in her, and even offered to pay her off as if she were nothing. Her plan to distance Osinachi from him had worked, yet it hadn't brought her any closer to becoming queen. Now, with Prince Dozier's marriage to Princess Kedi only days away, her dreams seemed to be shattered. As she lingered outside the queen's quarters, she overheard something that made her freeze in her tracks. The queen's voice, questioning Osinachi about her pregnancy, and Osinachi's flustered reply. A wicked smile crept across Nena's face as a new idea took shape in her mind. She too had noticed Osinachi's changed appearance lately, and if Osinachi was pregnant, Nena planned to make sure the prince found out from her. This might be the opportunity I need, she thought, her smile widening as she savored the idea. With the marriage so close, news of a pregnancy would turn everything upside down. Maybe, just maybe, the elements were finally working in her favor. Luck, it seemed, had come knocking at last. Prince Dozier had just returned from a long day in the field when he saw Osinachi leaving the queen's chambers. The sight of her made his heart ache in a way he didn't fully understand. "Come on, you're getting married in just a few days," he told himself, trying to shake off his feelings. "This maiden doesn't want you." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to turn away. Immediately he got into the house and was about to settle down. A soft tap sounded at his door. To his surprise, Nena entered, her face streaked with tears. The prince's eyes widened, a mixture of irritation and worry filling him. Despite everything, he didn't want to see anyone in pain, not even her. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice cautious but gentle. "Why are you crying?" Nena's lips trembled as she wiped her tears, her voice shaky and low. "It's a terrible news, my prince. I'm so scared." "Come on, just tell me what's going on," he urged, stepping closer to her. Nena took a deep shuddering breath. Then, in a rush of words, she blurted out, "I am pregnant, my prince." The prince's face went pale. "What? You're pregnant?" His voice rose with shock and anger. At that moment, the door flew open, and Princess Katie strode into the room. Her expression was one of pure rage, and Dozier instantly knew she had heard everything. Without a word, she walked right up to him and slapped him hard, the sting making his cheek burn. "You fool," she shouted, her voice thick with betrayal. "Is this what you do? First, it was Osinachi, and now this one." She threw a disgusted look at Nena, who was sobbing pitifully in the corner. "I thought maybe it was only Osinachi, and that with time you would get over it. But no, I was wrong. Here you are with another maid. And to think that you even got her pregnant. I'm so disgusted at you." Tears began to stream down her cheeks, her eyes filled with hurt and fury. "I knew you never truly wanted this marriage," she spat out, her voice shaking. "Well, you've won. I'm ending it. You can have all the maids in this palace for all I care." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The prince stood frozen, unable to meet Nena's eyes. Shame and frustration twisted inside him, his mind reeling. "What have I done?" he thought, feeling the weight of disappointment pressing down on him. He imagined what his parents would think, how they would be devastated by the chaos he had brought upon their family. After a long, tense silence, he finally turned to Nena. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice heavy. "I never meant for things to turn out this way. I will stand by you and take responsibility for my actions. But I just need time to think." Nena nodded quietly, hiding the satisfaction bubbling inside her. She hadn't expected Princess Katie to be there, but this twist only made her plan more perfect. The prince believed her, and now he was bound to her. With a polite nod, she walked out of the prince's chamber, closing the door quietly behind her. Her heart raced with excitement as she imagined the future that now felt closer than ever. The king sat on his grand throne, his face dark with fury. His hands clenched the armrest as he struggled to contain his rage. King Achor had just called off the marriage. What was supposed to be a proud day for the kingdom had turned into a public disgrace. His voice shook with anger as he spoke. "My son, my only son, involved in affairs with the palace maids. And now, a maid is pregnant with his child. Is this what I sent him abroad to learn?" His voice shook as he slammed his fist on the arm of the throne. his face turning red with anger. Beside him, the queen sat silently, her face clouded with sorrow and disappointment. She lowered her head, her heart heavy. "I sensed it," she murmured, barely audible. "I knew something wasn't right. I took Osinachi in like my own daughter, cared for her, trusted her, and this is how she repays me, by ruining my son's future, his marriage." Her eyes burned with frustration. Feed a poor dirty dog from the slum, and she will one day turn and bite your fingers. She will pay for this. I swear it. Just then, Prince Jose entered the hall, feeling the tense atmosphere settle around him like a storm. His parents looked at him with cold disappointment, and he could feel the weight of their anger and disapproval pressing down on him. Queen's face twisted with fury as she rose from her seat and strode towards him. Without a word, she raised her hand and struck him hard across the cheek. The sharp slap echoed in the silent hall. "You disgust me," she spat, her voice thick with emotion. Prince Jose lowered his head, swallowing the sting of her words and the slap. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low but steady. "I take full responsibility for Nena's pregnancy. I was drunk that night, and I didn't know what I was doing. If anyone should face consequences, it should be me, not her. I'm sorry, Father. I'm sorry, Mother." "Nena?" The queen's eyes widened in surprise. She had assumed it was Osinachi who was carrying her son's child. "Oh," she gasped, stunned. This just kept getting worse. The king's face grew darker, his voice a low growl, as he looked his son up and down. "You are a disgrace," he barked. "A man who cannot control his manhood is a weak man. I wanted only the best for you. A life of dignity, honor, respect, and duty. And now, you've brought shame to this family. Why a maid? Why disgrace yourself and this kingdom like this?" Prince Jose's heart sank as he listened to his father's words. He knew his parents were deeply disappointed in him, and there was nothing he could say to change that. He had messed up, and he was ready to accept the consequences. Slowly, he turned and left the hall, feeling the weight of their anger settle heavily on his shoulders. As he made his way back to his quarters, his mind spun with regret. Ever since that night, he hadn't touched a single drop of alcohol. The guilt gnawed at him daily, knowing he had thrown away his future and was now bound to a woman for whom he felt nothing. This was the price he had to pay for his mistakes, and he would carry it alone, knowing he had let everyone down. Nina watched with satisfaction as her plans unfolded just as she had hoped. The marriage was called off, and now she had a prince to herself. Everything was falling into place, but there was still one obstacle standing in her way: Osinachi. She knew that as long as Osinachi was around, her place as the future queen would always feel threatened. She secretly hired someone to keep an eye on Osinachi, reporting on her every move and waiting for the perfect moment to execute her plan. Now, that the prince's heart had been torn from Osinachi, Nena was ready to make her next move. "I want her gone," she told the man she hired, her voice sharp with determination. "Osinachi is the only thing standing in my way of becoming queen. Sadly, the prince loves her. Make her disappear. Make her disappear as if she never existed." One night, as Osinachi was heading back to her quarters, one of the palace guards approached her. "Excuse me," he said with a polite bow. "There is someone outside the palace who is asking for you. She says she's a relative of yours." "A relative?" Osinachi asked, surprised. She hadn't seen any family since her father's passing, and she had no close relatives that she knew of who would visit her, and especially not at night. "Who would be looking for me now?" she murmured, a hint of worry flickering in her mind. "It's an old woman," the guard replied. She seemed quite concerned and had been waiting for a while, but I couldn't bring her to you without permission. Reluctantly, Osinachi nodded. "All right, lead me to her." She followed the guard, her mind racing with questions. She couldn't imagine who might be waiting outside for her, but the guard's insistence made her feel she should at least check. They reached the palace gate, and as Osinachi stepped outside, she glanced around in the darkness, searching for any sign of this supposed visitor. "Where is she?" she asked, scanning the shadows. Before she could say more, 3 men appeared from the darkness, grabbing her roughly and covering her mouth from screaming. Panic filled her heart as she realized she had been tricked. Who would do this to her, she wondered, struggling against their grip. But the men were far too strong, dragging her forcefully towards the thick forest. In the forest, they threw her to the ground, where she landed hard on the dirt. The men raised sticks and began to hit her, striking her angrily with each blow. Osinachi screamed, her cries echoing in the trees, but she knew no one could hear her out. She clutched the earth, her fingers digging into the ground, as she tried to shield herself from the relentless blows. Each stick landing on her sent ripples of pain through her body. The beating continued until she grew weak, her vision blurring as dizziness overtook her. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she slumped to the ground, slipping into unconsciousness. The men stopped, checking her still form to ensure she wasn't breathing. Satisfied that she was completely dead, they left her there and returned to the palace, convinced that their mission was complete. For days, Osinachi was nowhere to be seen, but in the palace, no one seemed to notice her absence. The queen was too burdened by the recent troubles, the broken engagement, the shame brought upon the family, to worry about Osinachi. She assumed that perhaps the girl had run away. The queen knew that she had no family and nowhere to go, but she was too overwhelmed by her problems to think about Osinachi. The palace returned to its routines, unaware of the dark fate that had befallen her. Weeks had flown by, and Nena's belly began to bulge. At first, she felt thrilled, imagining she had finally secured her place in the royal family. Osinachi was out of the way, and the marriage had been called off. Yet, despite her growing pregnancy, things were not as she had hoped. The prince barely spoke to her, and when he did, his words were filled with only pity and guilt. The queen, who once had been like a mother to her, now looked at her with cold disdain. Nena had thought that carrying the prince's child would earn her respect, affection, and care from everyone. But it seemed her plan was unraveling. The prince still didn't love her, and each day her frustration grew. She could feel the bitterness rising as she realized that love, unlike power, couldn't be forced or manipulated. One evening, as the stars began to fill the sky, Prince Dozie wandered the palace gardens, his mind restless. Weeks had gone by, and he hadn't laid his eyes on Osinachi. The emptiness in his heart was a constant reminder of her absence, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had asked around, but no one had seen her leave the palace. Every attempt to find her led nowhere, deepening his worry. Where could she be? Was she even safe? Nothing seemed to add up. As he walked through the quiet parts of the garden, he suddenly heard voices speaking in hushed but fierce tones. He stopped, listening carefully. "You promised to pay me as soon as the job was done," a man's voice growled. "Months have passed and still nothing." "Just be patient," replied a voice he instantly recognized. It was Nena. "Once the prince marries me, I will get the money and settle you." The prince felt his heart sink. "Marry her?" "But I don't see that happening," the man said, his voice laced with bitterness. "The prince still doesn't love you." There was a sharp sound, a slap. "Don't you dare say that to me. Ever," Nena hissed, her voice shaking with fury. "I am the future queen of Omenka. Prince Dozie will be my husband. He has no option." The man, now furious, grabbed her roughly. "Let this be the first and last time you lay a hand on me," he growled. "You have 3 days to get my money, or I will tell the prince everything. He will be so disappointed when he hears that the child you carry isn't his, but mine. And I will tell him the truth, that it was Osinachi he was with that night and not you. All you've done is trap him with guilt and blackmail him into getting married to you." "You wouldn't dare," Nena's voice was full of desperation. "Remember, if I go down, you are going down with me. You were the one who killed Osinachi." "And whose order was that?" he replied coldly. Prince Dozie staggered back, his heart shattering as the weight of the truth crashed over him. Tears filled his eyes, his chest tight with grief and rage. That night, it had been Osinachi. Though he was drunk, all the memories he had about that night was Osinachi's. The way she smelled, the way her body felt on his. He had been right all along. But it was too late. She was gone because of Nena's desperation and wickedness. He felt as though he were in a nightmare, but this was real. Unable to hold back his anger, he stepped out of the shadows and approached them. his eyes blazing with fury. Nena and the guard froze, their faces paling as they realized he had overheard every word. Nena's hands began to shake, her braveness crumbling in an instant. "Please, my prince," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Please, forget what you heard. It's not true. They are all lies." But the prince's face was set, his voice cold and unyielding. "Enough," he said, his words cutting through the air. "You deceived me, manipulated me, and killed the one I loved. How do you expect me to love someone like you? How do you even sleep at night?" His gaze was fierce, his pain raw and evident. "There will be no forgiveness for what you've done." "But, my prince, no!" He raised his hands, cutting her short. His heart was heavy with pain and rage. He could hardly believe that even now, after all her wicked deeds had been revealed, she still tried to defend herself. His voice shook as he glared at her. "You!" he shouted, his voice filled with pain and anger that he could barely contain. What failed him? What he had done was beyond forgiveness, and she would have to pay for her cruelty. Tears streamed down his face as he thought of Osinachi, all that she had suffered because of this woman. The memory of that night flooded his mind, and he clenched his fists, trying to push it away. But the more he thought about it, the deeper his heart ached. "Guards! Guards!" His voice rang out through the darkness, shaking the walls of the palace. In seconds, the palace guards came rushing to him, and he ordered them to seize Nena and her accomplice. The guards didn't hold back, beating them severely before dragging them to the palace dungeon, a dark, cold place meant for the kingdom's worst criminals. Under the prince's watch, the guards forced them to confess the names of those who had been part of the evil plot. And soon, every person involved was captured. The punishments would be severe. The villagers would gather to hear the confession, and then Nena and her accomplices would face the harshest sentence the kingdom reserved for wrongdoers. The next morning, the villagers gathered, provoked and terrified by the confessions they had just heard. Even the king and queen were speechless, unable to believe that Nena, someone they had known and trusted, would commit such evil, all for the throne. "Tofiakwa," the villagers shouted, spitting in disgust. Anger swept through the crowd. Unable to hold back themselves anymore, the men began picking up stones, cursing and throwing them at Nena and her accomplices. They stoned them until they lay lifeless on the ground. By morning, their bodies were taken to the evil forest, far from the village, as a final punishment. Back in the palace, a deep silence fell over everyone. The prince mourned Osinachi, refusing comfort from anyone. He had loved her, and now that he knew everything she had endured, the pain of her loss was even sharper. He felt a deep guilt, blaming himself for her death. If he hadn't crossed paths with her, if he hadn't brought her into his life, perhaps she would still be alive. There was no way he could ever feel happiness again. No other woman could ever make him feel what he had felt for Osinachi. Weeks passed, then months, and soon years. Prince Josiah threw himself into his work, focusing all his energy on the farmland he had started, hoping to quiet his mind. But 2 years went by, and his sorrow remained unchanging. He had grown into a sad man. To make matters worse, tragedy struck. His father, the king, fell terribly ill, his health fading quickly. With the king's condition worsening, it became urgent that the prince find a wife to secure the throne. This time, the queen spoke to him gently, giving him permission to choose any maiden he wished. But her words held a sense of urgency. "It's been 2 years, Dozier," she said softly. "It's time to be strong, to make a decision as a man. This is the throne we speak of, and it's not a child's game." After much thought, Prince Joseph finally decided that he needed time away. He would journey to a distant kingdom, far from the memories of his own, to clear his mind. Only then would he return with a clear mind and then find someone to marry. The queen agreed to his plan, though she worried, asking him not to stay too long. They didn't know how much time the king had left, and every day mattered now. As the queen watched her son leave, her heart grew heavy with sorrow, and tears filled her eyes. She prayed silently that he would find what he needed on his journey, that he would return stronger, wiser, and ready to lead his people with strength and kindness. She knew that he carried so much pain, and she hoped this time away would help him heal. Dozier traveled far, eventually arriving at a small lively town called Obodezi. The town was like something from a dream, surrounded by clear waters that sparkled under the sun, with lush green hills rising in the distance. The people of Obodezi seemed to carry a natural happiness, their laughter filling the air as they went about their days. Fishing was their main occupation, and there was a calm, peaceful rhythm to their lives that drew the prince in. Here in this vibrant place, he hoped he might finally find peace. The peace he had been seeking for so long. He rented a small, lovely apartment on a quiet street at the edge of the town. The apartment was simple but beautiful, filled with sunlight during the day, and from his window he could see the mountains rising in the distance. This view alone made him feel a little more at ease. He had always loved being so close to nature, and this view of the mountain gave him a sense of comfort. For the first time in ages, he felt he could breathe freely. Each day, he would mount his horse and ride out to explore the different corners of the kingdom. The cool air brushed against his face, carrying the scent of the river and wildflowers. The people of Obodezi greeted him warmly with smiles and cheerful greetings, making him feel welcome. In time, he made a new friend, Jehu, a cheerful, hardworking farmer who knew every corner of the town. Jehu became his guide and companion, and the two spent their evenings together, riding along the hills, laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying the easy pace of life in the village. One place Jehu often talked about was Mama Chi's pepper soup joint. "You have to try it," he would tell the prince with excitement. Mama Cheese pepper soup is the best you will ever taste. And her palm wine. Oh, it's nothing like you've ever tasted. We should go one evening, my friend. You won't regret it. But every time Jeku suggested it, Prince Dozie would always shake his head with a polite smile, finding an excuse to avoid the busy spot. He wasn't quite ready to be around too many people. His heart still needed the quiet, but Jeku's enthusiasm was hard to ignore. And after many suggestions, the prince finally gave in one evening. "All right," he said, smiling at Jeku's eager face. "Let's go to Mama Cheese. I'm ready to see what all this excitement is about." Jeku grinned, clapping his friend on the back. "You won't regret this, my friend." Together, they made their way through the quiet streets, the scent of spices drifting through the night air as they approached the little pepper soup joint. For the first time in a long while, Prince Dozie felt a glimmer of curiosity and anticipation, wondering what this lively little town still had in store for him. The place was lively, filled with laughter and cheerful voices, as people enjoyed their bowls of steaming pepper soup and cups of fresh palm wine. An old tune played softly in the background, adding a cozy, familiar charm to the air. Prince Dozie looked around, surprised at how welcoming the atmosphere felt. This was different from what he had expected, and as he found a spot to sit down, he thought, "This isn't bad at all." But just as he was settling into his chair, a small figure dashed out from the crowd and accidentally ran into him. Startled, Dozie looked down to see a little boy sitting on the ground, rubbing his arm and looking ready to cry. Dozie felt an unexpected tug at his heart. Gently, he bent down and lifted the boy up, brushing the dust from his clothes. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, trying to soothe the child. "No need to cry. Where is Mama?" "Mama," the boy mumbled, his small hand pointing in a vague direction. Dozie's gaze followed, but before he could make anything out, he heard a voice, a familiar, gentle voice that made his heart skip a beat. "Dozie, why don't you stay in one place? Why are you always running around?" the voice called, growing closer. He felt a rush of memories flood back as he straightened up, holding the boy by his side. When he turned, his eyes locked onto hers. It was her, Osinachi. She was alive, standing right in front of him, looking just as surprised as he was. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, both too stunned to speak. For Prince Dozie, it felt unreal. He had been told she was dead, that she had disappeared forever. And for Osinachi, the sight of him here, in this small town, was just as shocking. She feared what this meant. Why was he here? Did he know about her son? Had he come to take him away? Quickly, she reached out, pulling her son close to her, and without another word, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Dozie frozen in place. Jeho watched the scene unfold, his brow furrowed in confusion. He could see how shaken his friend was. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Dozie finally managed to sit down, his mind still reeling. He turned to Jeku, and as best as he could, he told him the story of everything that had happened. The tragedy, the lies, the betrayal that had led him here. When he finished, he looked up at Jiku, his eyes filled with hope. "Do you know anything about her?" he asked. Jiku nodded slowly. "Not much," he replied. "She is known as Madam Chi's daughter. Madam Chi's husband, Uwakwe, a well-respected hunter in this village, brought her home about 2 years ago. Rumors has it that he found her injured deep in the forest. No one knew where she had come from or what had happened to her. After a few weeks, they realized she was pregnant, and she's been living with them since then. But the boy, well, I believe that's her son." Prince Dozier's heart raced as he absorbed the story. There was no mistaking it. This was Osinachi. She was alive. And if what Jiku said was true, the boy was his son. She had even given him his name. He didn't see her again for the rest of the evening, but it didn't matter. A deep joyous relief washed over him. Coming to this small town had been no accident, and he knew he couldn't leave until he had spoken to Osinachi, until he told her all that was in his heart. His journey to Bodesi had led him to a miracle he never thought possible. The next morning, as the sun rose over Obodoezi, Prince Dozier, with the help of Jehu, made his way straight to Madam Chi's house. He knew he needed to speak to Osinachi, to clear up everything that happened, and to make sure he never lost her again. He wouldn't bear it if this was to happen. When he arrived, Madam Chi and her husband welcomed him warmly, sensing the importance of his visit. They offered him palm wine, and as they sat together, he began to share his story with them, speaking honestly about the betrayals, the lies, and how he had believed Osinachi was dead. Osinachi, however, refused to come out, choosing instead to stand behind the door, listening closely. Tears streamed down her face as she heard everything. The truth about Nena's cruel plan, the blackmail, and the dangers she had faced. It was hard for her to believe that Nena, once her closest friend, had caused so much pain to everyone just to become queen. Later that day, she finally agreed to sit with Prince Dozier, seeing that he had played no part in all of this. They found a quiet spot under a large shady tree, and he poured out his heart to her. "I never stopped loving you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day, I blamed myself for what I thought was your death. I didn't know I would ever see you again. But here you are. Please, I don't want to lose you again." It was an emotional evening as they shared their heartache, their longing, and the struggles they had faced apart. They cried together, finding comfort in each other's presence, and Osinachi's heart softened. Despite everything, her love for the prince was still as strong as ever. Over the following weeks, they spent every moment they could together in Obodoezi, reconnecting and healing their old wounds. They explored the town together, laughed together, and talked for hours, rebuilding the bond they had thought they lost forever. Prince Jose knew without a doubt that they were both meant to be, and Osinachi felt her heart growing light again, full of love and hope. For the first time in years, she felt truly happy. Finally, the time came for Prince Dozier to return to Omenka, Before they left, he thanked Madame Chi and her husband deeply, presenting them with many gifts. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "You gave me a second chance at happiness. I promise to take care of her and make sure she's always safe and loved. Please, come visit us whenever you like. You are now part of our family." Madame Chi and her husband were sad to say goodbye to Osinachi, who had become like a daughter to them, bringing warmth and joy into their lives. But they were happy, knowing she was no longer returning to Omenka as a maid, but as the queen-to-be. Jeku was also sad to see his old friend leave, and he promised to always come visit when he could. When Prince Jose returned to Omenka with Osinachi by his side and their young son, the entire village erupted in joy. Word spread quickly that the prince had returned, and that Osinachi, whom many thought they had lost forever, was alive and well. The people of Omenka gathered to welcome them, thrilled to see their prince happy once again. The queen's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her grandson for the first time. The boy's face held a striking resemblance to her husband, the king, and she felt a wave of love and pride. With tears streaming down her face, she embraced Osinachi tightly, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for bringing my son back to life. We thought we had lost him." And so, Prince Dozier and Osinachi stood, surrounded by family, friends, and the people of Omenka. Their hearts were full, and they knew that finally their story had found its happy ending. The marriage between Prince Dozier and Osinachi was arranged swiftly, and the entire kingdom erupted with joy. The palace overflowed with villagers, dancers and singers, all eager to celebrate the union that had been long awaited and deeply cherished. Joy filled the air as Prince Dozier and Osinachi exchanged vows, surrounded by the laughter and cheers of the people. It was a true feast of love, one that united not only the two of them, but also the hearts of everyone in Omenka. A few weeks later, the kingdom faced a great sorrow, as the king, who had ruled with such kindness and wisdom, passed away. The people mourned their beloved king, remembering his generosity and strength, and honoring his legacy with gratitude. Once the mourning period ended, it was time for a new era. Prince Dozier was crowned king, and beside him stood Osinachi, the love of his life, and now his queen. Their reign was filled with peace and prosperity, as they led with compassion and wisdom, restoring hope and happiness to the land. They were blessed with more children, filling the palace with laughter and warmth. Together, Dozier and Osinachi found comfort in each other, their love only growing stronger through all they had endured. They ruled with kindness, ensuring their people were cared for and heard. Their legacy became one of peace and harmony. In each other's presence, they found lasting joy, knowing that nothing would ever tear them apart again. And so, King Dozier and Queen Osinachi lived happily ever after, cherished by their people, surrounded by family, and deeply in love for all their days. Hey besties, we've come to the end of this amazing story. Like, it's been a long ride. I'm sorry for keeping you all waiting, and if you've watched to the end, I want to say a very big thank you to you. You guys are the real MVP. Thank you for always standing by, thank you for always supporting me, and thank you for always cheering me on. I hope you enjoyed this story and also learned one or two lessons from it. I would like you to share your lesson in the comment section. And please like the story, share it with your family and friends, and don't forget to subscribe if you are yet to subscribe. Thank you so much for all your support and love. I love you guys so much from the depth of my heart. Right now, I'll have to go and see you in our next story. Bye!